The church smelled like lilies and old secrets. Black coats shuffled past me, murmuring condolences that felt like sandpaper. My heels echoed on the marble floor as I walked toward the front pew. Then the doors opened. Claire entered like she still owned every room. Daniel walked beside her. My ex-fiancé. The man who once kissed my ring and whispered forever. The man who left me for my sister. Her hand rested on his arm a little too tight. Her dress was tailored to perfection, just like her lies. I stayed seated. My heart didn't race. Not anymore. But Daniel stopped walking when he saw James, my husband, standing tall. One hand resting on the polished wood of my father's coffin. The other tucked in his charcoal gray suit, precisely tailored, deliberately silent. Daniel blinked. Claire froze. And for the first time in 6 years, they didn't look smug. They looked scared. I looked down at my mother's silver locket around my wrist. I'd worn it for her, not for them. The priest began to speak. But my mind was louder. I remembered the scent of betrayal, lavender and cologne. 2019. The night I heard Claire giggle over the phone, and Daniel whisper back, thinking I was asleep. He proposed with a ring that caught the sunlight, but she caught him. They left me with nothing but silence and a sketchbook full of crumpled dreams. I moved to Seattle, built a firm from the ashes, met James, and healed. Now at our father's funeral, Claire had to watch me live the life she tried to steal. I didn't need revenge, I had peace. But watching her flinch, that was unexpected grace. I adjusted my coat, looked her in the eyes, and smiled. She turned away. Daniel's jaw clenched. Funny how the dead aren't always the ones in the casket. Would you have forgiven your sister? Or walked away forever? Where are you listening from? Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories about justice, closure, and healing after betrayal. The kitchen tiles in our condo were always cold in the mornings. Even with socks, even in spring. I used to stand there holding a mug of burnt coffee, watching the condensation gather on the window above the sink. The sky over Portland always looked like it hadn't decided who it wanted to be. Daniel preferred espresso pods. He liked things clean, efficient, curated. Like our apartment. Like the way he'd chosen me. I remember one morning late February. He stood at the island, buttoning his shirt, barely glancing up. I might have to fly to San Diego next week, he said. His tie was navy. The one I'd given him for Christmas. I nodded, lips tight around my coffee cup. I thought we had the tasting with the caterer. He paused, briefly, then shrugged. Push it. They'll understand. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the sink full of clean dishes. Not dirty, just unnecessary. That's how it started. Not with a blow, but with a drift. A steady vanishing. I still smiled when we had dinner with his colleagues. Still wore the ring. Still talked about venue choices and honeymoon plans with my mother, but I felt it. The hollowness. Like I was living inside a model home. All furniture, no warmth. He was getting harder to reach. Meetings. Late-night calls. Trips he didn't bother explaining. One night I walked into the bedroom and saw his phone glowing face down on the nightstand. Claire's name flashed across the top before it faded. It felt like a slap. But deeper. Slower. More humiliating. I didn't say anything that night. I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling fan spinning like a carousel I couldn't get off. His breathing was steady. Mine was tight, sharp. I remember the exact thought. If I bring it up, he'll lie. And I'll have to believe him. Or leave. But I wasn't ready to do either. Not yet. It was a Saturday. Clouds low and heavy, the kind of gray that soaked into your mood without permission. Daniel was in the shower. His phone was on the dresser, unlocked. Buzzing. Over and over. I told myself not to. Told myself I trusted him. But my hand moved anyway. Fingers trembling. Pulse pounding in my throat. I opened the screen. Messages. Dozens. Her name Claire. Her photo. Her lipstick. her legs bare under a silk robe I'd never seen before. One message read, "Still thinking about last night. You tasted like champagne." I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping like it always did on his side. My breath came short. Each inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. I didn't cry. Not then. Something colder settled in my chest. A tightening, a hollow, my sister. The one who used to braid my hair before school. The one who stole my birthday spotlight with those fake tears and ballet recitals. She took everything I earned, and still somehow was the favorite. I dropped the phone back onto the dresser. It clattered louder than it should have. He didn't hear it. Water was still running. He was humming. I looked around the room. Framed engagement photo on the dresser. My sketches stacked neatly on the desk. A pair of heels by the closet I hadn't worn in months. Everything felt like someone else's life. Like I had stepped into the wrong version of my story and couldn't find the way out. I walked to the living room. Paced. Saturday on the armrest. Stood again. Ran my thumb along the spines of books we never read. The air smelled like eucalyptus body wash. His. Still steaming through the door crack. My mind kept whispering the same thing. This is real. This is happening. They chose this. Over you. I didn't wait to hear his excuses. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream. I just stood there barefoot on those cold kitchen tiles and made a silent promise to myself. I won't compete for love again. I left on a Tuesday. No big scene, no confrontation. Just a bag packed with my own things, a worn leather sketchbook, 2 sweaters that still smelled like lavender detergent, and one Polaroid of Mom and me from Cannon Beach. I didn't leave a letter. Only the ring resting on the marble counter like an artifact. Daniel was at a client lunch. Claire was probably somewhere buying flowers to make herself feel innocent. I drove north. The highway was slick with spring rain, Seattle pulling me like gravity. I found a short-term rental on the east side, a second-floor walk-up with old carpets and creaky pipes. The kind of place where no one asks questions, just hands you keys and says, "Good luck." At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake listening to the hum of someone's late-night television through the wall, gripping my pillow like it owed me something. I ate crackers and string cheese for dinner that week. Didn't speak to anyone but my therapist. The first thing I drew was a room with no doors. Then a room with no windows. Then a room with both wide open. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in drafts. Small sips of air. Then came James. At a design expo downtown. He wore gray. Had a quiet voice. His questions weren't invasive. Just present. Like he saw past the damage and still wanted to linger. We started with emails about lighting choices. Then coffee. Then a client project we somehow ended up co-leading. I didn't trust him at first. Didn't even trust the way he stirred his coffee, but he never pushed, just waited. Like someone who knew the value of patience. One evening after a long meeting, he offered me a ride home. It was raining. Of course it was. We sat in his SUV while the wipers squeaked across the windshield. I don't need to know everything he said, his hand resting near mine on the console. But if you ever want to share, I'll listen without fixing. No one had ever said that to me. Not even Daniel. Especially not Claire. That night I let him walk me to the door. And when I turned the key, I realized this place, this life, it was mine, not what they left me. But what I'd chosen. What I'd built with my own 2 hands. It had been 6 months since I left Portland. 6 months of rebuilding routines, finding quiet in the small things. I'd stopped expecting Claire's name to appear. Or so I thought. That evening I was parked outside a Thai place on Capitol Hill, my phone buzzing with a group text from old friends. Look at these 2. Finally tied the knot. Followed by a string of heart emojis. I clicked without thinking. The photo loaded slowly. First the sky, sunset lit and rose gold. Then candles. A floral arch. And then them. Claire in a silk white mermaid gown. Daniel standing beside her, his hand on her back like it belonged there. His eyes trained on the camera, smiling like he'd never broken anything in his life. My lungs forgot how to breathe. The air in the car thickened. Rain tapped against the windshield like it wanted to get in. They didn't just move on. They turned their betrayal into a celebration. I zoomed in. Her bouquet was peonies. My favorite. His tie midnight blue. Same shade he wore when he proposed to me. I didn't realize I was trembling until my thumb slipped and the screen went dark. It felt like the phone had rejected the memory too. The pain came in waves. Not sharp like before, but dull deep. A throb that nested under my ribs. How do you explain that grief still shows up even when you've made peace on paper? Even when your new life is better in every measurable way? I'd built a business. I had clients. I had James. But one photo, one frozen second from someone else's version of forever, and my hands were cold again. My eyes burned. I tossed the phone into the passenger seat. It bounced off a sketchpad and landed face down as if hiding its shame. The food was ready 10 minutes later. I took it home untouched. Later that night, I stood under the shower until the steam blurred the mirror. I stared at my reflection, hair wet, eyes tired, a woman who had survived. And still didn't feel safe. I wrapped myself in a robe and sat on the bed, legs tucked under me like a child afraid of the dark. Seattle's sky was the color of bruises, blue-gray, swollen with rain. They hadn't just hurt me, they'd erased me. Rewritten the ending without asking. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered to the silence. Why do I still feel like the one who lost? The next morning, I buried myself in work. Emails. Floor plans. A renovation bid for a lakeside property in Snohomish. I poured myself into the details, cabinet finishes, lighting angles, tile textures. Things that didn't lie. Things that didn't leave. My office smelled like cedar from the sample boards. The windows faced north, soft gray light seeping in, gentle, unassuming. James stopped by around noon. 2 coffees in hand, his coat dripping rain on the entry mat. He didn't say much, just placed 1 cup on my desk and unwrapped a muffin like he'd done it 100 times. Blueberry. You skipped breakfast again. I looked up. Forced a half smile. Guess I did. He sat across from me, close but not imposing. That was James. He never demanded space, he offered it. Like a porch light in the fog. We talked about the Henderson remodel. Deadlines. Budget trims. But his eyes kept searching mine. Not prying, just present. I hated how much I wanted to lean into that stillness. Hated how safe it felt, because safety had fooled me once. Daniel had been gentle too until he wasn't. James handed me a folded paper napkin. I didn't realize my fingers had been digging into the cardboard coffee sleeve. You okay? He asked. Soft. Real. I looked at him, and for one terrifying second, I almost told him. About the wedding photo. About Claire. About the tightness in my chest that hadn't let up since last night, but the words lodged behind my teeth. Just tired, I said instead. Long night. He nodded like he knew I was only offering the surface. And respected it anyway. When he left, the room felt colder. Like the air had lost its weight. I opened my sketchbook. The page was blank. But my hand hovered, pencil ready. I wanted to draw something that didn't feel like them. Didn't smell like betrayal. Didn't taste like regret. But everything I tried looked like echoes. Rooms I'd already lived, doors I'd already walked through and slammed behind me. That night I didn't draw, I cleaned. Rearranged the throw pillows. Refolded sweaters. Scrubbed the stove even though I'd barely cooked that week. There's a kind of comfort and control in making your outer world neat when your inner world feels like broken glass. At some point, I found myself standing in the doorway to my bedroom, staring at the bed. 2 pillows. One still plumped, barely touched. James had never stayed the night, not because he hadn't offered, but because I hadn't asked. I didn't know how to invite someone in when I still felt like I was renting space in my own life. The next morning I woke to sunlight rare for Seattle in spring. It poured across the hardwood, warm and wide, like a promise I hadn't earned. I made oatmeal. Not because I wanted it, but because it felt like what healed people did. Then I took a walk. No music. just footsteps and birdsong. On a corner near Volunteer Park, I saw a small flower shop, the window fogged from the inside, buckets of tulips lined along the glass. I stepped in. The bell chimed delicate and high. A woman with silver hair smiled from behind the counter. "Let me guess," she said, "you're buying flowers for someone who finally deserves them." I blinked, then laughed. Too hard. Too long. She didn't ask. Just handed me a bundle of peonies. I paid in cash. Walking back, I passed couples with strollers, a woman sipping coffee in a denim jacket like mine, a man opening the passenger door for someone who smiled at him like I used to smile. And I thought, maybe I can still have that. Maybe I deserve to. That evening, I called James. Asked if he wanted to come by for dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup. He paused. Then said, "Yeah, I'd like that." I set 2 plates. Poured 2 glasses. Left the second chair pulled out for the first time in a long time on purpose. When the doorbell rang, my heart didn't panic. It beat. Solid, certain. Like maybe healing wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about remembering and choosing to open the door anyway. The email came at 2:12 a.m., no subject line, no greeting. Just one name in the inbox, Claire Harper. My finger hovered above the screen. The glow of my phone painted the room in a cold blue light. James was still asleep beside me, his breaths even and soft, grounding me. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I also knew I wouldn't sleep until I did. I tapped. It opened with a single line, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but please, let me say this." I sat up in bed, pulled the blanket tighter across my lap. The silence of the room suddenly felt suffocating. She went on. "You don't have to write back. I just needed you to know that I think about it. About you. About what I took. I was selfish. I see that now. I see it every day in the way Daniel looks at me, like a choice he's stuck with." I read the sentence twice. Then again. She wasn't apologizing. Not really. It was guilt without humility. Regret without repair. "Mom always said you were the strong one." I never wanted to believe that. But I do now. You built something from the wreckage we left. I envy that more than I can say. I wanted to feel vindicated, wanted some piece of me to stand up and whisper. She finally sees it, but all I felt was tired. And faintly, deeply, sad. Not for her, but for who we used to be. I put the phone down, face down on the nightstand. Pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes. The darkness behind my lids bloomed red and orange. Memories flared, sleepovers, shared prom, dresses, our mother's laughter from the kitchen while we sang off-key to 90s hits. Sisters. Before we were women. Before we knew what it meant to choose ourselves over each other. I didn't wake James. I just lay back down, turned my body away from the nightstand and stared at the wall until the sky outside turned slate gray. In the morning, I made coffee like usual. Measured the grounds, poured the water, waited for the machine's hiss and drip to fill the silence. James kissed my shoulder as he passed behind me. His touch lingered, but I didn't tell him about the email. Not yet. Not today. It wasn't shame, it was protection. For myself. For the fragile layer of peace I'd built like new skin over old scars. By noon the email was still unread, at least officially. No reply. No draft. No plan. But it lived in my mind. Camped there like an uninvited guest. Every time I passed my phone I felt its weight, heavy, persistent. I went to the office early that day. Told my assistant I'd be in the archive room sorting samples. Truth was, I just needed quiet. Needed the smell of old catalogs and wood veneer to calm my nerves. Needed to be somewhere Daniel and Claire had never touched. I pulled open a drawer labeled 2018 projects. Inside were color palettes, client photos, sticky notes in my handwriting. The kind I used before everything cracked. Tucked between 2 folders I found a Polaroid. It was Mom. Standing in front of her garden in spring. Lavender blooming behind her. Wearing the denim apron she always said made her feel useful. Her smile was crooked in that way she had when she knew something before you did. She wasn't posing. Just caught mid-laugh, probably because Claire and I were bickering about who stole whose shirt. I held the photo to my chest. Closed my eyes. Let the scent of sawdust and fresh paper wash over me. Mom would have told me to forgive. But not to forget. She was never the turn the other cheek kind of woman. She believed in justice, but she believed in softness too. I could still hear her voice from years ago. Holding on to hate is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. But this wasn't hate. Not anymore. It was something quieter, more bitter. Like the aftertaste of coffee left on the burner too long. I sat down on the bench near the window. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing, people crossing the street with umbrellas and headphones, the ordinary rhythm of lives untouched by my story. I envied them. That ability to move forward without looking over your shoulder. James called later that afternoon. Just to ask if I wanted dinner. I almost said no. Almost told him I needed space. But then I remembered the photo. Mom's laugh. The way forgiveness wasn't about them, it was about me. What I chose to carry. What I chose to release. So, I said yes. And meant it. Even if my heart still hesitated, James made roasted tomato soup and grilled cheese. Simple. Comforting. Exactly what I hadn't known I needed. He didn't ask why I looked distant. Didn't comment on the circles under my eyes. Just set the table, poured me sparkling water with a lemon wedge, and let the silence be soft, not suffocating. I watched him move around the kitchen like he'd always belonged there. Confident but quiet. Measured in the way only people who've been broken once can be. He sliced the sandwiches diagonally. Always diagonally. Better geometry for dipping, he once told me, like that solved anything. And somehow, it did. We ate mostly in silence. Between bites, I noticed the flicker of candlelight against the backsplash, the scent of thyme and grilled butter, the way he looked up every few moments, checking not on my words, but on my energy. I swallowed. Then, said, Claire emailed me. His fork paused midair. He didn't flinch. Didn't lean forward like he was owed a secret. Instead, he nodded once. Waited. I let the words tumble slowly. Not the whole story. Just the bones of it. Guilt, regret. No apology. He listened without interruption. And when I finished, he simply asked, how do you feel about it? I stared at my plate, crumbs scattered like tiny decisions. I'm not angry, I said finally. Not exactly. But I don't want to feel anything at all. And that scares me more. He set down his spoon. His voice was steady. Maybe not reacting is the first sign you're healing. I nodded. Not sure if I believed him, but grateful for the kindness in his tone. Later we sat on the couch. No television. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards under us. I leaned into his shoulder. He didn't wrap his arms around me right away. He waited until I sank fully into the moment. Then he held me, not tight but right. It felt like the first time in years someone touched me without wanting to fix me, and for the first time I didn't flinch when I felt safe. I didn't check the door. Didn't wait for the betrayal hiding behind it. I just breathed. Not as a woman preparing for war, but as a woman learning to live even with echoes in the room. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A gray one where even the birds outside my window sounded tired. It was the nurse from Mom's assisted living center. Her voice was warm, practiced, but I heard it. The shift. The care behind the caution. She's okay for now, she said. But she's not bouncing back like she used to. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the mug of coffee in my hand until the steam faded. When I arrived, Mom was sitting by the window wrapped in her soft green cardigan. The one with a tear in the cuff she refused to fix. She looked smaller somehow. Not frail, but less rooted. Like the tree that always stood outside our childhood home after Dad left, still there but leaning more each year. Hi baby, she said, her voice papery and gentle. Did you bring the peonies? I hadn't. But I lied. I'll pick them up tomorrow. She smiled like she knew I was lying, but let me have it. We sat in silence. The kind only shared between two women who had run out of small talk but not out of love. Then she said it, out of nowhere, as if we were mid-conversation already. "I want you and Claire to make peace." I looked down at my hands. The knuckles tight, the nails I'd forgotten to trim. "She wrote me," I said quietly. "She wants to say sorry, but only just enough to sleep at night." Mom didn't scold. Didn't defend. She just nodded. "I know," she whispered. "She's always reached for things that weren't hers. But sometimes people break what they touch and don't know how to admit they miss it." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I'm not ready," I said. "I'm not sure I ever will be." She patted the empty chair beside her. "You don't have to forgive her. But don't let her take more than she already has." That was my mother. Even with failing lungs and trembling hands, she could still hand me a truth sharp enough to cut through years. I stayed in Mom's room that night, curled up on the small guest cot by the window wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and old pages. She slept lightly. The kind of sleep that drifted in and out like waves, never fully resting, never fully alert. At 2 a.m. she called my name. Not loudly. Just enough for me to sit up. "Emily," she whispered. "You remember the blue house on Hawthorne?" I nodded, even though the room was dark. Of course I remembered. That was where we went every Easter when I was a child. Painted eggs in the backyard. Claire always cheated. She used stencils. I free-handed everything and still came in second. "Your father planted the maple tree there," she murmured. Her eyes half closed, her voice wrapped in memory. "He said it would grow taller than the roof. Said we'd watch it from the kitchen window when we got old." Silence. Then she exhaled long, like letting go of air that had been trapped for years. "But he never stayed long enough to see it bloom." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say. The next morning, I made her tea. Chamomile, her favorite. Added honey, even though she used to say it ruined the flavor. She didn't drink much of it. Just held the cup, hands trembling slightly, like the warmth was enough. On the nightstand sat a framed photo of us three, Mom, Claire, and me at Cannon Beach. All windblown smiles and matching sun hats. I was 14. Claire 12. It struck me how long ago that really was. Not just in years, in lives. In versions of ourselves we no longer carried. That night I cried, not loudly, not for anyone else to hear. Just in the quiet, pressed into the crook of my arm, as the oxygen machine hummed steady behind me. I wasn't crying for what Claire did. Not for Daniel. Not even for the years I'd lost. I cried for the inevitability of things. For how even the strongest women eventually go quiet. On the third evening, I helped Mom brush her hair. Each stroke felt slower than the last, the brush gliding through silver strands that used to be the color of chestnuts. She used to complain about her grays. Now she wore them like they were earned. And they were. She looked at me in the mirror, eyes soft but sharp. "You used to hum when you brushed your hair," she said. "Every morning before school. Same song. That Norah Jones one." I smiled. "Barely." I forgot that I said quietly. "I didn't," she replied. "You always hummed louder when you were nervous." Her hand found mine. Cold, but steady. "Don't be afraid of peace, Em. Sometimes it's scarier than chaos, but it's real." That night I lay in the cot again. But I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the sound of her laugh before it was reduced to a whisper. Tried to hold the texture of her hands in my mind, how the skin had softened, but the shape still felt like home. Memories kept pressing in. The time she came to my school with dry clothes after I fell in the fountain. The way she taped my art projects to the fridge, even the ones that weren't any good. The way she called me Em like it meant something more than a name. And under all of it, the quiet knowing. This was the last chapter with her. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. But soon. She was slipping, not dramatically, just gently, like a boat pulling away from the shore with no sound. The next morning I walked down to the small gift shop in the building. Bought a bundle of peonies from the corner cooler. They weren't fresh, edges a little brown. But they were hers. When I placed them in the vase by her bed, she opened her eyes for a second, smiled. Just barely. I knew you'd remember, she said. And that moment, small quiet hit deeper than any apology Claire could ever write. Because she remembered me. Before betrayal. Before heartbreak. Before I built the walls. And I knew right then I had to find closure. Not for Claire, not even for Daniel. But for her. So that the version of me she loved could live again. Chuan 6. After I returned from Mom's place, something in me had shifted. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but undeniably. The world hadn't changed. Claire was still Claire. Daniel was still the man who smiled while ruining lives. But I was different. I came home to my quiet apartment, kicked off my shoes, and stood in the center of the living room just listening. No ticking clock, no creaking pipes, just stillness, the kind that used to scare me. Now it felt like armor. I made tea Earl Grey with honey, then opened my laptop. Not out of impulse, not because I was spiraling, but because it was time. I typed in Claire Harper Interiors. Her website popped up second on the list just beneath her latest article in a local design magazine, the sister duo that never was, one woman's rise in the Seattle design scene. I didn't click it. I didn't need to. The damage was already visible. Her logo looked familiar. Too familiar. The typography. The curve of the H. The same warm gray background I used in my first pitch deck 5 years ago. I opened my old files. Compared. My jaw clenched. Not from rage, from recognition. She hadn't just borrowed from me, she'd traced me. I scrolled through her portfolio. 3 of the rooms were nearly identical to mine, color palettes, mirror placements, down to the ceramic lamp I'd sourced from a small Vermont artist. Claire had always been clever. She never copied enough to trigger alarm. Just enough to leave me invisible in my own work. I grabbed a notepad. Started making a list. Project names, dates, my original files. I printed 2 comparison boards. Taped them to my wall. Stood back, let the patterns scream for themselves. I didn't want revenge. But I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted to stop disappearing. The next day I scheduled a meeting with a friend, Sasha. An intellectual property lawyer I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Her email back was immediate. Bring everything. Let's talk boundaries. For the first time in a long time I slept without waking. No dreams, no shadows, just breath. And a sentence that repeated softly in my head, you're not overreacting. You're remembering who you are. Sasha's office sat on the 3rd floor of a historic building downtown. Exposed brick walls. Tall windows that let in slanted morning light. Bookshelves lined with case law and framed photos of her rescue dogs. When I walked in, she was already pouring coffee. Same dark roast she always swore by. Same cracked white mug that said, "Trust women." She hugged me. Not too tight, just enough to say, "I see you. I've got you." Then she gestured to the table between us. "Let's get to it." I laid everything out. Side-by-side mock-ups. Color codes. Emails showing original design dates. Screenshots from Claire's website. Sasha didn't interrupt. She took notes with a green pen. Her brows furrowed only twice. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and looked at me like she'd known something I hadn't. "This is clear," she said. "Not just emotionally, but legally." I exhaled slow and long. My chest unclenched in places I hadn't noticed were tight. "You're not imagining this," she continued. "She's lifted more than inspiration, and the fact that she's profiting off it. That matters." I nodded. 1,000 quiet yeses running through my veins. "But here's the real question. She leaned forward. Eyes steady. Voice calm but unshakable. "What do you want?" I blinked. My mouth opened, then closed. No one had asked me that, not in a long time. Not without expecting an answer that made them more comfortable. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. "I don't want to ruin her," I said. "I just want the truth to have weight. I want it to mean something again. Sasha nodded. That's possible. But you'll have to hold your ground. I've been doing that since she took everything. She smiled. Not pity, pride. Then let's put it in writing. We discussed next steps. Document preservation. Cease and desist language. Options if things escalated. It wasn't about courtroom drama. It was about boundaries. And reclaiming credit where it had been stolen. Before I left, Sasha paused. You're not doing this to fight her. You're doing this to stop disappearing. I walked out into the sharp Seattle air. Wind tugged at my coat, but I didn't hunch. I walked tall. For once not just surviving but moving forward on my own terms. That evening I sat at my dining table, pen in hand, blank page in front of me. Not an email, not a text. A real letter. I didn't need it to be digital, I needed it to feel final. I stared at the page for a long time. Letting the silence stretch, letting the words rise only when they were ready. Then I wrote, Claire, I received your message. I've taken the time to sit with it just like I took time to sit with the wreckage you left behind. What you called mistakes had consequences. What you called regret came too late. This letter isn't to reopen old wounds, it's to close them properly. You didn't just take Daniel. You borrowed my name, my voice, my work, and wore them like they were yours to begin with. I won't chase acknowledgement. But I will protect what I've built. You'll be hearing from my attorney regarding the appropriation of my designs. This isn't revenge. This is redirection. This is the point where I stop shrinking so you can feel taller. You don't need to respond. There's nothing else to discuss. But know this silence from me doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. Emily, I folded the letter. Slipped it into a cream envelope. Wrote her address in pen that didn't shake. It felt cleaner than I expected. Not satisfying. Not triumphant. Just necessary. I walked it to the mailbox 2 blocks away. The street was quiet, wet leaves along the curb. The kind of stillness that feels earned. When I let the envelope fall through the slot, I didn't look back, no part of me needed to. That night I lit a candle in the kitchen, lavender like Mom always used. I let it burn until the whole apartment smelled like memory. But softer. More mine. And when James called, I answered on the second ring. I didn't tell him what I'd done. Not yet. Instead, I said, I'm free tomorrow. Want to meet at that bookstore you like? He said yes. And in his voice I heard something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not for what was ending, but for what was finally quietly beginning. Some justice doesn't need shouting. Just a clear line that won't be crossed again. Have you ever drawn that line for yourself? I'd love to hear how. The morning after I mailed the letter, I woke up with a strange calm in my chest. No dreams. No tightness behind my ribs. Just a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years, not since before the betrayal, before the silence. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Not the quick pod kind. Real beans. Slow pour. The smell filled my apartment like intention. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop, titled it Worth, just that. One word. Simple, undeniable. Inside, I started sketching ideas for a community design showcase, a collaboration of female-led firms across Seattle. No entry fees. No gatekeeping. No Claire Harper aesthetics recycled from someone else's bones. I called it Second House. Not because it was a physical space, but because it was the version of home women like me had to build after the first one was burned down. By noon I had a name list. By 2:00 p.m. I had emailed 5 women I'd admired from a distance for years. Some I'd never spoken to. Some had been in the same rooms as Claire but never looked at me like I didn't belong. The responses were fast. Yes. Yes. Absolutely yes. One even wrote, "You have no idea how long we've needed something like this." But I did know. Because I had needed it too. James stopped by that evening. Brought wine and a bar of sea salt dark chocolate. No questions. Just a soft kiss on the cheek and that look that said, I see you taking up space. And I like it. We sat on the floor, blueprints spread around us. Not for work, just for dreaming. I told him about the project, about the folder, about how I wasn't just building a defense, I was building something forward. He smiled. You're not just protecting your story anymore. You're writing the next chapter out loud. I looked at the laptop screen at the word worth glowing in bold across the folder icon. And for the first time I believed it. His name was David Langston. He ran a boutique development firm in Bellevue. One of my first big pitches was to him years ago when I still wore my hair straight and my voice softer than I needed to. Back then, Claire had come with me, claimed she was just observing. But 2 weeks later, David redirected the entire project to her new concept. The concept she presented with the same tone language, even the title slide I had designed. I never confronted him. Never even followed up. I just faded like women taught to protect peace over their own position. Now, 5 years later, I sat across from him in a sunlit corner of the Finch, a quiet cafe in Madison Valley where the coffee came in handmade mugs, and the air always smelled like lemon zest. He looked older. Still sharp. But with that slight discomfort men wear when they realize you're not the same girl they once underestimated. I've been hearing your name more lately, he said, stirring his espresso too fast. Word is you're building something interesting. I smiled. Not too wide, not too sweet. I said. Second house. It's not just a showcase, it's a reset. He leaned forward. Interested now. Investors love words like momentum and reset. You're not partnering with Claire on this. That was the moment. The old version of me might have laughed awkwardly, tried to brush it off. Not now, no, I said plainly. She borrows. I build. He blinked. Didn't push, just sat back and let the weight of it settle. I slid a folder across the table. Brand deck project timeline key collaborators. This isn't about rebranding, I said. It's about taking up space where we've been edited out. He opened the folder. Brows lifted once. Then again. This is clean, he murmured. Focused. Sharp. It's mine. He nodded. Slow, measured. I want in. Whatever you're doing, it's time. I nodded once. Held his gaze. Let the silence stretch just enough to remind us both this was not a favor. This was recognition. When I left the cafe, the spring breeze brushed against my cheek. Gentle but electric. I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was choosing what to leave behind. That weekend, I sat by the bay window in my apartment, sunlight warming the hardwood floors, the soft hum of traffic below like a rhythm I could finally move to. I opened my laptop, created a simple, elegant PDF. Muted tones. Sharp typography. No frills. Just vision. Subject line: second house, a collective reintroduction. I began writing. Not a pitch, not a plea. A declaration. Dear name. I'm writing to share something that matters to me and maybe to you too. Second House is a curated collaboration of women-led design firms across Seattle. No titles, no pecking order. Just integrity, space, and story. Some of you know my work. Some only know my name whispered through the wrong mouths. That's about to change. This isn't a comeback, it's a correction. And you're invited to witness what it looks like when women stop apologizing for their blueprint. Emily Harper. I sent it to 15 people. Developers. Venture creatives. A few old clients who once faded after Claire stepped in. No attachments, no follow-up. I closed the laptop. Walked into the kitchen, lit a lavender candle. Poured a glass of still water into my favorite green ceramic cup, the one Mom gave me the year I launched my firm. And I waited for nothing. Because I didn't need applause. I wasn't building for validation anymore. I was building for clarity. For memory. For legacy. By Monday morning, 7 replies had come in. 4 yeses. 2 requests for coffee. 1 quiet acknowledgement that read simply, "You're right, you always were." I stared at that one longer than the rest. It didn't come with money. Didn't come with headlines. But it came with truth. And that was enough. Later that night, James asked me how it felt. To finally speak louder than the lie. I thought for a long moment, then said, "It's not about being louder. It's about not lowering my volume for anyone again." He smiled, tucked my hair behind my ear. And in that silence, I realized justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it just showed up in your inbox with your name spelled correctly for the very first time. The venue was a renovated warehouse near the waterfront. All white brick and steel beams, soft lights strung across the ceiling like constellations. We'd named the night's second house the ground we build on. No red carpet, no flash photography. Just sketches on linen boards, story snippets handwritten beneath each design. It wasn't about ego, it was about reclaiming authorship. People arrived early: investors, design journalists, architects who'd once smiled at Claire while pretending not to see me. But this time they shook my hand, asked me questions, listened when I spoke. And then she walked in. Claire. In cream. Always in cream. She moved like someone still expecting to be welcomed. Daniel wasn't with her. She carried a small clutch, but the weight she bore was something else entirely. Her eyes found mine across the room. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a wave. I simply turned to the young designer beside me, a first-gen Latino woman who'd just opened her studio, and said, "Ready to present your piece?" She nodded, hands trembling, but voice clear. As she spoke, Claire drifted closer. Not to me, but to the display boards. She stopped at mine. The before and after installation. 2 rooms. One chaotic dim, filled with clashing shapes, the other clean, layered, warm. Underneath the caption read, "Same walls. Different story." One told with consent. Her face didn't change, but her grip on the clutch did. Tighter, knuckles pale. Still, she said nothing. Did nothing. Because what could she say? The room was watching. Not because I asked them to, but because energy shifts when the person who was erased refuses to stay silent. James appeared beside me, offering a small glass of sparkling water. I didn't expect her to show, he murmured. I did, I replied. She needs the room to see her. But tonight they see me. And they did. Not just the curated version, but the woman who had rebuilt herself tile by tile, truth by truth, until no one could mistake her work for anyone else's again. The event ended just after 9. Guests lingered, laughing in small circles, swapping cards over the last of the Prosecco and rosemary almonds. I stood near the back, watching the room breathe around itself. This was no longer Claire's world. It wasn't mine either. It belonged to all of us women who'd been cut out, talked over, talked down to. Tonight we'd taken the mic back without raising our voices. I turned to gather my coat when I felt her presence before her voice. Emily. I didn't flinch, just paused. Let the name hang in the air between us. She stood behind me, shoulders squared, that same tilt of her chin, the one she used when trying to appear calm under pressure. I just wanted to say, congratulations. Her voice was low, careful, measured, like a PR apology. I turned slowly, met her eyes. There was no venom in mine. No tears, just the clarity of distance. Thank you, I said. Nothing more. She shifted her weight, glanced around, lowered her voice. I saw the letter. The lawyer. The showcase. I didn't realize you. You didn't have to realize anything, I interrupted. Tone even. Quiet, but unyielding. You just had to stop pretending I was gone. She opened her mouth, but the words stalled. I saw it. For the first time, hesitation behind those polished eyes. Maybe it was guilt, maybe just surprise, that I'd become someone she could no longer narrate. She reached out, fingertips grazing the edge of my sleeve. I never wanted to hurt you. I stepped back half an inch. No drama. Just enough. You did. Silence. I turned. Took 3 steps toward the door. Then paused. Not for her, for me. Without turning around, I said, you don't get to rewrite what you broke. But you get to live with it. That's your ending. Mine is just beginning. And I walked away. No applause, no music swelling. Just the sound of my heels on polished concrete, steady, unapologetic. That night I didn't replay the scene. Didn't question my words. Didn't wish I'd said more or less. Because for the first time since it all fell apart, I'd faced her not as the girl she betrayed, but as the woman who outgrew her shadow. 2 days after the showcase, a small package arrived at my office. No return address. Just my name handwritten in soft cursive on a cream envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. My hands stilled. The air around me slowed. I closed the door, sat on the edge of my sofa, and held the envelope like it might disappear if I breathed too hard. Inside was a letter folded neatly in thirds with the faintest trace of lavender clinging to the paper. Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But let me say this, I never left your side. Not when Claire betrayed you. Not when Daniel walked out with pieces of your future. Not when you stood still and still kept breathing. I've watched you rebuild without rage. That takes more strength than revenge ever will. But I want to ask you something now, not as your mother, but as a woman who also had to survive. Don't shrink, not to keep peace. Not to be loved. Not because others are uncomfortable with your light. Build the life that scares them because it tells the truth. And if you must walk away, walk proud. Let your footsteps teach the ground something new. You were never too much. They were just not enough. Love always, Mom. I didn't cry. Not right away. I pressed the paper to my chest and sat in silence, letting her words soak into the places I'd kept guarded. Don't shrink. That's what she saw in me. That I had dimmed myself not just to survive, but to make others feel better about what they took. I stood. Placed the letter in the glass box on my shelf beside the first pen I ever signed a contract with and the ceramic key from the first space I ever designed alone. That night, I walked through my apartment with the lights on. All of them. Every room. I poured a glass of red wine, lit the candle by the window. Played Norah Jones softly just like I used to when brushing my hair before school. And I whispered aloud to the air, to her, to myself, I won't shrink again. Ever. The cabin sat tucked between tall pines, far enough from the city to hear the silence, close enough for the mail to still find me. I bought it last fall. 1 story, big windows. Wood that creaked like an old song. People asked why someone like me, successful, visible, would move somewhere this quiet, but they didn't understand. After surviving noise, silence is luxury. After betrayal, solitude is sanctuary. I didn't run from the world, I just chose a different rhythm. The front porch had 2 chairs now. One I sat in. One I left open. Not for Claire, not for Daniel, not even for James. For memory. For breath. For all the versions of me that never had a place to rest. I still ran my firm remotely now. Delegated more. Trusted the women I once mentored. Watched them make decisions in rooms I once begged to enter. Sometimes that's what legacy is. Not statues. Not speeches, just doors left open and hands no longer trembling at the handle. One morning I walked out to the mailbox. Inside was a small envelope. No return address. Just to Emily, from someone who's learning. Inside was a check. Large. From a donor I didn't know. And a note, your story helped me leave. Helped me start over. Helped me stop saying sorry for things that weren't mine to carry. This is for the next woman who needs that same push. I sat on the porch with the check in my hand and I cried. Not the broken kind, not the grief kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've become the version of yourself your younger self prayed for. That week I filed for a new 501c3, the ground we build on. A fund. A mentorship circle. A seed program for women rebuilding after emotional theft, whether from a partner, a family, or themselves. It wasn't loud, it wasn't viral. But it was true. 1 story. 1 letter. 1 woman standing on ground she finally knew was hers. That was enough to begin. It started with a funeral invitation I never expected to receive. Claire's mother-in-law, Daniel's mother, had passed away. We hadn't spoken in years. But the envelope arrived in her handwriting. Still neat. Still slanted. Still painfully familiar. I wasn't close to that side of the family. But she had been kind to me once back when kindness still felt safe. So I went. Not to reconnect. Not to be seen. Just to close something that no cease and desist letter or whispered apology ever could. I wore a black wool coat, simple slacks, no jewelry. No intention to impress, only to arrive as who I was now. No longer the woman they remembered. The chapel sat on the east edge of Portland, small white bricked with blue hydrangeas arranged around the altar, their petals already starting to brown. I sat near the back, close to the door. Not to escape, but because I didn't need to be near the front anymore. Claire walked in just before the service began. Hair tight in a bun. Coat cream. Of course. Daniel followed a step behind her. He looked older. Hollow in the eyes. The kind of man who used to walk like he owned everything and now seemed afraid to trip over his own silence. They sat 3 pews ahead. Claire didn't turn around. But I knew she saw me. You feel some people before they speak. And you remember the ones who spoke before they felt. The eulogy was brief. Kind. Generic. Someone near the front wept softly. Daniel bowed his head. Claire blinked fast, but not for long. When it ended, the crowd trickled out in hushed clusters. I walked into the cold air, inhaled the scent of pine and gravel and wet grass, and exhaled more than I expected to. I stood under a tree near the parking lot, hands in my coat pockets, watching the doors behind me. I wasn't waiting for her. But I knew she'd come. Claire stepped out a few minutes later, coat buttoned, shoulders pulled tight like she was bracing for wind that hadn't come yet. She spotted me immediately. Of course she did. Her steps were hesitant. Measured. The way someone walks when they're not sure they're welcome but can't bear to leave without trying. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I let her come to me. Emily, she said. Soft. Softer than I remembered her being in years. I gave her a small nod. Not cold, not warm, just acknowledgement. She looked thinner, eyes a little darker. But her voice still had that polished ring, the one that always tried to make discomfort sound like grace. Thank you for coming. She would have liked that. She was kind to me, I replied, and that was all I owed her. Claire shifted her weight. Looked away, then back. I saw the article, she said. The showcase. The interviews. You've built something really powerful. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because silence said more now. She waited for me to fill it. I didn't. So she continued, Daniel and I, we're separated now. It's not public yet. I'm not telling you to get sympathy. I thought you should know. I looked at her. Really looked. Not the sister I grew up with. Not the woman who took what wasn't hers. Just a person who was finally starting to feel the weight of her choices. I hope you find peace, I said simply. And I meant it, but not for her comfort, for mine. She nodded, eyes glassy, but she didn't cry. Claire never cried in front of anyone she couldn't control. I was wrong, Emily, she whispered. I know it's too late, but I need you to hear it. I gave her the gift of that moment. Let her say it, let her feel it, but I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. It had never been. I just stepped back. Said, take care of yourself. Then turned and walked toward my car, the gravel crunching beneath my heels like punctuation after the last sentence in a long, unfinished chapter. Back at the cabin, the light through the pine trees felt warmer. Not because the weather changed, but because I had. I poured tea into my mother's old ceramic cup. Lavender and lemon. My favorite, hers too. I stood on the porch watching the breeze ruffle the rosemary in the planter box. It had grown wild lately, stubborn, tangled, alive. Like me. Inside the mailbox that afternoon was a letter with unfamiliar handwriting. No return address, just my name, spelled correctly. No title. No miss. Just Emily. I opened it slowly. The ink was slightly smudged like it had been written with a trembling hand. Dear Emily, I read your story. All of it. I'm in the quiet part now, the one where everything hurts but nothing bleeds. Where people call you strong just because you're still standing. I haven't told anyone what happened to me. Not yet. But I saw you. And something cracked open. Not in pain and possibility. Thank you. You didn't save me, you showed me I could save myself. Love S. Then again. And I knew this was the moment Mom meant when she told me to stop shrinking. Not just for me, but for the women I'd never meet, whose names I'd never know, but who would walk the same road I once crawled. That evening I packed a box. Inside, a new journal, a photo of the porch at sunset, a silver key I slipped in a card that read, "This place is yours for now. Rest, rebuild. And when you're ready, pass the key to someone else." I left the box by the front door. No postmark, no label. Just an open invitation to a new beginning. Then I walked to the edge of the porch, exhaled slowly, and whispered what I wish someone had once said to me. Justice can be quiet, but it is never weak. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories about justice, closure, and healing after betrayal. Have you ever had to forgive silently or walk away louder than words? Where are you listening from today? Drop your city below. Let's keep building each other's second house.